We really are honored today to be joined in conversation with Terri Freeman, who's president of the National Civil Rights Museum. She was appointed to this position in 2014, and in that time has expanded the museum's public programming, including events to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination and address contemporary civil rights and human rights issues. Before joining the foundation, Ms. Freeman served as the president of the Community Foundation for the National Capital Region. I'm going to ask her later what she misses most about living in DC. And before that, launched the Freddie Mac Foundation. She holds degrees from the University of Dayton and Howard University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start by asking what I think is sort of a deceptively straightforward question. What would you say that your job is? Not your job description, but what does it actually mean to be president of a museum? How do you spend your time? And what does it look like to be successful in your position?
Sure. So thank you again for having me, Claire. I think that what I would describe as my day-to-day activity really is, and especially right now in this kind of COVID environment, making sure that the museum is operational, that people are able to have a really good experience while they're here, but also to highlight the fact that the history that is reflected on the walls of the National Civil Rights Museum are applicable to what we are seeing in our communities today, and what it means to understand the historic American civil rights movement and how that is relatable today. So it actually, my role also is to kind of use the museum as a bit of a bully pulpit to push forward the legacy of the folks who are represented on these walls. So in a kind of strange way, I have this role of being a conscience for the community through the people who are reflected in this space, and to continue to try to help people understand what it meant then, what it means now.
One of the things that we're increasingly talking about in our classes and in the nonprofit sector is the role of identity or identities in leadership and in our professional lives. And how do you see that your identity or identities shape who you are as a leader and the work that you're currently doing?
So it's interesting because I'm not certain when I first came to the museum that I really understood how closely I was connected to what this museum represents. But as I began to think over the many stories that I had heard during my growing up from my parents and from my grandparents in particular on how they had to operate and navigate this country, if you will, particularly thinking about my grandfather, who was a darker brown skinned man, and my grandmother, who was probably about your complexion, and them traveling across the country to visit friends and family, and her having to be on the floor of the back seat of the car for fear of them thinking that he was driving in the front seat with a white woman. Not really understanding how those stories made me who I was, but also how those stories are exactly what is replicated here in the museum. So I think my Blackness it provides me with a certain perspective on what I see. I think my age provides me with a certain perspective on what I see. Not really old enough to remember those days as much as remembering seeing my mom cry for the first time when King was assassinated. So all of those things connected me to the museum and to the history.
The stories we tell about ourselves and who we are, I think, are so powerful and such a rich gift that museums give to us. Your career has moved in somewhat of a non-traditional direction for the nonprofit sector, right? We know that it's far more common that leaders move from leading nonprofits into philanthropy.
Mhm.
And you've moved in the opposite direction, right? You started in foundations and in philanthropy and are now the head of a nonprofit. So I
Mhm.
want to hear what that transition was like for you in the move from being grant maker to grant seeker, and if there's any wisdom or insights that you bring to that role or wish you'd known earlier instead of thinking about that pivot in your career.
So first, I'm gonna say that philanthropy tends to forget that they too are nonprofit organizations. Okay, I used to have to say this all the time when I was in philanthropy. We too are a part of the nonprofit sector or social profit sector, which I prefer. And the other thing you have to understand, Claire, is that while yes, my first job in philanthropy was corporate philanthropy, my second was community philanthropy, which requires you to raise money. So this was not an unknown to me. It's not like I came from an independent Ford Foundation, where I was really just thinking about how to give away dollars. I really had to kind of think of how am I going to bring dollars in to be able to give money away. I think that actually my knowledge and understanding of how philanthropy actually works is very helpful in this particular role. I know what I know what program officers look at and what they don't look at. I know what the length of relationships likely is with individuals versus independent foundations versus community foundations versus corporate foundations. So I have a background that, yes, usually people go the other way. I think it's very helpful in allowing me to do the work that I do and to understand the relationships that are so important to maintaining a good donor base for the museum. So it's been very helpful. And frankly, I don't really think it matters which way you move. I think what we learn in these roles that play an important part in building community is that relationships are always key. And whether it's relationships that you're building with potential donors, relationships that you're building with nonprofit service delivering organizations, relationships that you're creating with the public sector, they're all really, really important for us to be able to do our jobs as we move forward. So, I try to help people understand that raising money really is, yes, there are some things that you need to know about fundraising, skill wise, but really you need to understand human beings and how human beings relate to each other. If you can do that, if you believe in the organization that you are stewarding, then you'll be successful in raising money.
Mm. No, it is so much about relationships. And I think in the classroom, we try and there, and to your point, there are concrete skills about what this looks like, but it's about human connection, right? Storytelling and the sort of connections between people that makes this whole world go around in the nonprofit sector and elsewhere, right? And to marshal all of that knowledge from your previous positions, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Um, Over the summer, you wrote a series of blog posts on the museum's website, and I read them before our conversation, and I encourage others on this uh, call to do the same. And I found them to be really powerful and personal responses from you to the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed. And you connected the work of the civil rights movement of the 1960s to the continued push for full freedom today. And you wrote about the very real pain of racism.
Mhm.
What was it like to write those, both personally and professionally? And I'm wondering whether you got pushback from people or perhaps donors saying, in effect, stick to history, right? That your connection of past and present um, was powerful. And I want to know what that was like, if it was a risk for you to publish those words, what that was like for you, and how it's landed broadly.
So the benefit of age, Claire, is that you just don't care what people think as much. It's kind of like, this is my truth, and I actually felt as though what I was writing was not just for me. I was not simply representing this place and what this place represents, but I was writing for so many Black people. And it this was a very tough it was a tough time for all the obvious reasons, but then I had some personal tragedies in my life over the course of this year. And in just thinking about how far we have not gone, it was really painful. I have three daughters, I have three grandkids. One is, and I wrote this in one of my blogs, that my grandson, who is 4, is autistic. He's tall for his age. He's a beautiful soul, but he's 4. What happens when he turns 9? When he's tall enough to be seen as a challenge and people don't understand why he's responding the way he is because he's different. I'm scared to death every day for my grandson and for my son-in-law and for my husband even, and every other African American man and woman, who has to deal with a society that sees them first as a threat. And that is what I was trying to express, that um, people, some people just don't have to deal with that. But it is a very real thing to wake up in the morning and look at the reflection that looks back at you and be proud of who you are, but also understand that a lot of people don't understand who you are. And that's what I was trying to get across. And our skin color, our melanin should not determine how people view us. And for me not to write something as the president of the National Civil Rights Museum in a tone that was personal would have been to almost present a false narrative to the community. And some people, frankly, will listen to my voice when they won't listen to other people's voices. Now, with regard to the issue of pushback, nobody pushed back directly, although I'm certain that there was pushback. There always is. But again, my truth, my integrity, my story, you can choose to believe it or not. But I know what my life's journey has been. I know what the journey of my parents and my grandparents have been. I know what the journey of friends, families have been. I know what the journey has been for uh, young Black men who, for whatever reason, didn't make it out of high school, and had to operate by street justice, if you will. I understand that. And for me not to say something would have truly been for me to present a false narrative.
I think we think so often about the risk of taking action, and it's the risk of not taking action or not saying something that I think we need to put forward more often as the question. And I hear you saying there was a risk of not saying something.
I mean, people, this museum is located at the assassination site of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not, I have a dream. That wasn't all he was.
Mm-hmm.
He was beyond Vietnam. He was where do we go from here? He was a letter from Birmingham jail. And people have a tendency to just want to put him in this box of peaceful nonviolence, and this idea of kumbaya. But if you listen to interviews of King, particularly between 67 and 68, you will get a reflection of the man who was very concerned with where we were. And in fact, may have thought that, in fact, I think his quote was, the American dream has turned into a nightmare. And so I try to make sure that people understand that when we express these feelings, this is not against, what King would have done, who he was. No, this is exactly in line and what he would expect us to do in times like these.
Yes. So I want to ask a question about this moment that we're in right now, sort of pivoting from those posts that you wrote. That we're in the midst of an election where there's open disenfranchisement, there's a pandemic that's disproportionately killing people of color, there's a rising tide of white supremacy and police violence, increasing climate threat, incredibly high rates of unemployment. And these are all immediate crises about survival.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to ask what the role of a museum is in these kind of crises, or to think more broadly about the role of a museum in public life, or how can and should a museum that's focused on the past help us address problems of the present?
So I think about the role of museums a lot, as I don't have a background in museum management. I'm not a historian. Um, I'm just one who loves institutions that present art and culture and history. At this moment, I think, as difficult, frankly, as it was to make a decision to reopen this space in July, it was important to have this space open because people needed to get some level of understanding about this moment. And this particular museum presents that information, right? To have some understanding of what this moment might mean, of how were they successful 50 plus years ago, 60 years ago in some instances, to push forward um, in the middle of Jim Crow, in the middle of heightened white supremacy, in the middle of folks erecting statues to people who had died many decades before. How were they able to do that? What did organizing look like? How do I take what I learned here and apply it to a society where television isn't the medium now, but social media is the medium? Um, how do we look at economic equity issues as they existed then, as they exist now? So it provides a bit of a compare and contrast opportunity, but also it serves as a place for people to make a little bit of sense out of this. Now, that said, I'm not certain that there is anything on earth that can make sense out of this political climate, period. I've never experienced anything like this before. And it is a crazy time that is scary in so many ways. But what I do think all history museums tell us is that we've survived a lot. We're probably going to survive this too. I think that, even when we look at pandemics, we've had pandemics before. I'm here in Memphis. Yellow fever was a big issue. In fact, it wiped out a significant amount of the population of Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis, Tennessee is thriving. So we will get through this. But what history does present to us is a picture, a window into how things occurred, how things happen, what we can kind of assume will occur based on what we are seeing, and to be able to put those puzzle pieces together to figure out what the picture needs to look like as we go forward. I think of what this moment, and I don't even like to call it a moment, but what I think is happening at this time is not a new movement, but a continuation of a movement that had a lull for a while and is now picking back up. And I believe that those of them that went before us who were in this fight would be very proud of what they are seeing and the broad coalition that is multiracial, multi-ethnic, accepting of people's truths, and all working for justice is exactly what they were fighting for.
Thank you for that optimism. I want to ask a couple lightning round questions, which is also a cue to students and others on this to begin getting your question ready. So a few lightning round. In 2 or 3 words, how would you describe yourself as a leader?
Frazzled. I think that I am fair, and I am collaborative, and I am pragmatic.
Okay. What would you say is your personal theory of change?
I saw that question that you sent to me, and I'm not big into the whole jargon stuff that we use in our sector, but I guess
How do you think change happens?
we'll
take the theory out.
I'm just trying to. I think that change happens with persistence. I think change happens when people are open to learning to understand certain things. And let me give you an example. And this, people may think of me very differently when they hear me say this, but I'm going to be honest. When I began to realize that I needed to include my pronouns when I am in certain situations, I didn't get it at first. I really didn't. It just was so new and so novel to me. But now that I do it, I understand why this is so important to help people feel included and to ensure that we are addressing people the way they want to be addressed. Not something that was ever a part of my being, but I was open to it. I could have just said, nope, not doing it. But that's not the way we create change, and that's not how we create progress, and that's not how we create inclusivity.
Do you have a favorite item in the museum?
Oh boy, it kind of changes from moment to moment. I really do think we have a replica of a jail cell, and we have the phrases from a letter from Birmingham jail that pop up on the cell wall. And I think I connect so with King's concern about not the folks who are obviously hating us, but those people who say they're with us, but keep telling us to wait. Just slow down. You're trying to move too fast. Just hold it a little bit. And I so relate to that, because I think the place that comes from is this idea of, well, we don't want to be subjected to some of the things that you're subjected to. So let's figure out a better way to do this. I think that's probably the place that I kind of come back to in the museum most often.
Who would you say are some of your role models or heroes?
Well, most of my heroes and role models come directly from my family. My mother, who I unfortunately lost this summer, was an incredible woman who, it's funny how you learn things about a family in death and how instrumental they were in certain things, and how committed. She was a dancer, and she was very committed to teaching Black children classical ballet. My grandfather, who was an artist and did sports promotion in his art coming up in Chicago, and until they realized that he was Black and they would no longer accept his drawing. So he continued to draw, but he worked at the post office as a clerk, and actually paid for me to get my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree from private institutions on the salary of a clerk. If I had to point to one person who I have always held in high esteem, it would be Barbara Jordan. She just was the orator that I always wanted to be, and had the presence that I thought was so important. And she did, with that presence and that oratory, really get people to listen to her across the aisle. and she was from Texas. And so for me, she was just an incredible role model. And I actually had the opportunity to work with her because she was on my board when I was at the Freddie Mac Foundation. And so it wasn't just what I had read about her, it was what I learned about her in meeting her.
And so I opened saying that I was going to ask you what you missed most about the DC, Maryland region. And so I want to ask that as my final lightning round question. You had to move to Memphis for this incredible job opportunity, but for those of us back here, what do you miss most?
Well, what I miss most are the people that I worked with. I lived in the region from 1981 to 2014. So that was a very long time, longer than any place else that I lived. What I don't miss is the traffic. But now none of us are really missing traffic that much since we're remotely. But it really is about the people, the support, my support circle that I had, and I miss. There's good catfish here, but I lived in Maryland, and I really miss crabs.
Wow. I think we probably all do, given how limited we keep to go outside, but I could keep going for a really long time with questions. This was really incredible, but we have a lot of people on this call who are also eager to learn from you and with you. So that's the end of my time